Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending the Campus Technology Distance Learning Summit. My name is Rhea Kelly, and I'm Executive Editor for Campus Technology. The Distance Learning Summit is being produced by the staff of Campus Technology and made possible by the generous support of our event sponsor, Citrix. I would like to welcome you to Session 3, entitled Online Learning Phase 2, Fine-Tuning Student Engagement for Equity. Students will need more than video lectures if they are going to survive and thrive in a digital learning environment. Now that many courses have made the jump from in-person to online, it's time to make sure that students of all demographics are actually being engaged and quality standards are being met. In this session, Dr. Jessica Rowland Williams, Director of Every Learner Everywhere, will share strategies for measuring student engagement and boosting outcomes with a focus on equity. Dr. Williams joined Every Learner Everywhere in October 2019. Prior to this role, she served as the Completion Grant Initiative Project Director for the University Innovation Alliance. She also worked as Program Director in Georgia State University's Office of the Senior Vice President of Student Success. She has devoted her career to expanding access, increasing graduation rates, and promoting student success among students of all socioeconomic backgrounds. Thank you all again for joining us today. And before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items for anyone just jumping on. First, if you would like to enlarge the slides, look for the square icon in the top right corner of the slide window. You can also view the presentation in full screen mode by clicking the squared arrows icon. If you would like to submit a question at any time, just look for the question field to the left of the slide window. Type in your question there and hit submit. We will field questions at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties during the session, look for the yellow question mark icon below the slide window. Click there for technical assistance. If you would like to download a copy of today's presentation, just look for the Resource Center below the question field. And finally, within the next day or two, we will email you a link to the archived version of this session so you can view it again or share it with a colleague. The on-demand version of the webcast will be available starting tomorrow. Okay, let's get started. So first off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your role and mission at Every Learner Everywhere?
Hi, Rhea. Absolutely. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here today. So I am originally from Atlanta, Georgia. My own undergraduate experience started at Spelman College, where I earned my bachelor's in biology, and then I went on Princeton University to do my PhD. And one thing that I found was that during my own higher ed experiences, I had a lot of very personal experiences with inequities and the difficulties that diverse students have to face in higher ed, particularly being a woman in science, a woman of color, and also a mother while I was an undergrad and also through my PhD work. And a lot of those personal experiences led me to gravitate towards work that provided me the opportunity to create educational spaces and policies and practices for students that were outside of the traditional status quo. So this work is deeply personal to me. After completing my postdoc, I did work at Emory University. As you mentioned, I've worked at Georgia State University. I've also worked at the University Innovation Alliance. And all of that work is focused around issues of student success, particularly for low-income students and students of color. And in October of 2019, I joined the Every Learner Everywhere network. And this network is very incredible, with an incredible mission. It's a network of 12 partner organizations that advocate for equitable outcomes in higher ed through advances in digital learning and innovative teaching practices. And at Every Learner, we really do imagine a future in digital learning that doesn't just perpetuate the inequities of our past and present, but establishes a future where technology is used to create learning environments that truly do provide equal and fair learning opportunities for every student. And again, that's something that's just deeply personal and a deep personal passion of mine.
Yeah. So a couple months ago, Every Learner Everywhere, in conjunction with the Online Learning Consortium and the Association for Public and Land-Grant Universities, came out with a free playbook called Delivering High-Quality Instruction Online in Response to COVID-19. And something I thought that was really interesting was that the very first section of that guide makes a distinction between online learning and emergency remote teaching. And I think referring specifically to what was going on this spring. Can you talk about what the difference is between those two?
Yeah, I would love to. I think it's an important distinction. I think first I'd like to just, highlight that, as we all know, we are really living in unprecedented times. This is, just remarkable what's happening in our higher ed system and just in our country across the board. And it's a very difficult time for both faculty and also for our students. And so, we drafted this playbook in collaboration with OLC and APLU, two of our network partners, to provide faculty with some very real-time support as they transition their courses online during these really difficult times. One thing that is important to note is that when we think about online education, and this includes online teaching, it's been around for decades. Online education is not new. And there have been a number of research studies, theories, models, evaluation standards, evaluation criteria that all focus on quality online learning and online teaching and online course design. And we know that from the research, we know that just like with traditional teaching and learning, the most effective online learning results from very careful instructional design and planning. And from work with our institution, the institutions that we work with in Every Learner, we know that this planning and preparation and development time required to create a high quality online course typically takes between 6 to 9 months before the course is ready to be delivered. And we also know that faculty are usually more comfortable teaching online by about the second or third iteration of that online course. So I'm highlighting this to make the contrast that, when we think about emergency remote teaching, one of the key differences is that there is a huge absence in the time and intentionality needed carefully to go through that careful design process that's so critical for the effectiveness of an online course. In addition, unlike online courses that are really planned from the beginning to be designed online, emergency remote teaching is a temporary shift in instruction or instructional delivery from face-to-face to some type of an alternative delivery mode that's happening directly in response to a crisis. And the primary objective of emergency remote teaching is not to recreate the robust experience in the classroom, but instead to provide a sort of temporary access to instruction and instructional support that in a way that's set up quickly and able to be reliable during an emergency. So these are two very different things. And I think when we understand, the difference, then we can start to separate, this common practice that we've sometimes engaged in our field, where we are always trying to compare emergency remote teaching to online learning.
Yeah. Well, obviously, so many faculty had an uphill struggle, in being forced into that emergency remote teaching. But of course, there have also been challenges on the student side. I guess let's call it emergency remote learning. Could you talk about some of the key issues for students?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think one that sometimes we don't ask it enough. So I think one of the obvious issues that we turn to when we think about our issues for students are, of course, issues of technology use and accessibility, both of which are very, very important issues and issues that we certainly do need to think about and focus on. But I think another issue that sometimes flies under the radar is, that learning online is very different than learning face-to-face. And the skill sets that students need to succeed online is also very different than what they need to succeed in a face-to-face course. And some of the challenges, some of the things that I think we need to explore include, beyond, of course, whether a learner or student has computer or internet access, are also things like, can the student communicate clearly through writing, or do they feel comfortable with that? Is the student able to retain knowledge from reading or online videos or podcasts or online discussions? Another thing is, is the student self-motivated and organized and disciplined enough to work independently? A huge one that we've learned recently, we heard through our student survey that we did recently through Digital Promise, one of our network partners, is, a lot of our students don't have quiet study environments or places to study. And another thing that even comes up is how often do our students regularly check their campus email? Some of our students aren't even checking their email. So there are a lot of very basic skills and kind of knowledge that our students require to be successful online that, we need to ensure that they have.
Yeah, so that brings the question of, what kinds of student support should institutions be putting into place to help kind of mitigate some of those issues?
I think that it is important for institutions to develop some more student-focused campaigns to support students in preparing them for online courses. I think that can be done through maybe some mentorship, even between students who are doing well in online courses or feel more familiar with the tools and the skill sets needed to be successful, and students who may be new. Another thing that's important, particularly for first-generation students and students of color, is the importance of community. We know that, when students are on campus, they usually have the support of, their friends and their other students in the class. And, when learning remotely, sometimes those same support systems aren't available. So I think it may be important for universities to find ways to bring in student support systems. So perhaps their parents or their grandparents or people in their community create space to also inform them on what might be useful or helpful to support students so that they can provide that in-person real-time support in the absence of having a campus environment.
Mm-hmm. So when we look towards the fall, there have been a lot of institutions announcing that they're reopening, or perhaps they're partially reopening, and most of the plans seem to involve at least some online learning component. And in particular, we've been hearing a lot about the HighFlex model, where students can attend the class in person or online synchronously. I'm just thinking from an equity standpoint, are there advantages and challenges to that format?
Yeah, so the HighFlex model is definitely becoming very popular as an option. Obviously one of the advantages is that it really does give the student the opportunity to decide, for a class or activity how they want to engage. And that can be advantageous for students, particularly students who are balancing a lot of competing priorities, family, jobs, and we know that that's definitely an issue for many of our students. One of the things that, we have to be mindful of is the fact that the learning experience must be equivalent for all the students, and find a way to guarantee that a student is not at a disadvantage due to the learning pathway that they choose. And so that's certainly a challenge for faculty to ensure that, all the modalities provide the same quality of learning experience. Another challenge of the HighFlex model is that it really places the responsibility on the student to succeed in the course, more so than when things are a little bit more structured. And that could be particularly challenging for students who maybe lack some of the skills and maturity and self-motivation to bear that type of responsibility for their own learning.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the considerations, like when you're designing a high flex course, are there some things you can do to make sure that students are getting the same experience? Like, for example, engaging them in like a class discussion, what are some ideas for making sure that experience is the same quality when you're in class or online?
I think one thing, of course, is to ensure that all of your course material, be it video or written work, is accessible. And, we know that many of our students they don't have access to computers, so they may be using their cell phone to engage in the course material. We know that, it's important if we're using videos, that they are captioned and, accessible in that way as well. So I think accessibility is critical because obviously students can't engage in material if they're not able, to access it. I think the other thing that's a key consideration is, that instructors have to be comfortable and effective with asynchronous teaching, which is very challenging. It can take a lot of time to design, an asynchronous track to a course that is effective and also engaging, find ways to engage with students in that context and modality. But again, that goes back to, my previous point about really ensuring that the learning experience is equivalent for all students and that they're not at a disadvantage for choosing any specific learning pathway, because if so, that would in fact, introduce more inequity into the course, which is, obviously counter to, the intent.
Mm-hmm. Now that faculty have a chance to be more intentional in their online course design, as opposed to the emergency move online we saw in the spring, what are some of the things that they should really be focusing on, in terms of best engaging students?
Yeah, I think this is very tricky in that we're still learning a lot about this. Again, in the we recently did a student survey through Digital Promise and a faculty survey through Titan Partners. Again, both of them are partners within our network. And the number one issue for both faculty and students was student engagement. The faculty said they had a hard time keeping the students engaged, and the students said they had a hard time staying engaged. So we know that this is a very real issue. I think one thing that we have to be able to consider is the personal connection that has always been very critical, particularly for students of color in an academic setting. And we have to somehow find ways to retain opportunities for that one-on-one academic mentorship, because it's, there's plenty of research that's shown that students who receive that academic mentorship, especially in their first year of college, have lower dropout rates, greater satisfaction with their experience, and also higher GPAs and increased academic performance. So I think that's, one thing that we would have to explore. I think the other thing that's just going to be important is finding ways to listen to our students and not make assumptions about what they need, what their challenges are, and what would be helpful to them. I think now is the time, if there ever was a time for us to really engage with our students, engage in dialogue, understand what's happening in their lives, and how to best structure environments that really truly do support their learning.
Mm-hmm. So when you're thinking about designing for equity in your online course. Can you give any concrete example of what does that equitable design mean? What does it look like in practice?
Yeah, a couple of concrete things I can elevate. First, of course, is, looking at course content. So evaluating the content, evaluating the activities, evaluating, statements that may be written to the syllabus, and ensuring that they demonstrate that, diversity is valued in the course. Another thing is to ensure that throughout the course there are multiple activities that actually require students to connect the course content to their social cultural backgrounds and the social cultural backgrounds of others. Another way to ensure equity would be to ensure that the course requires regular interaction between students that's intentionally designed to strengthen student connections and leverage the diverse student experiences and perspectives. So really allowing students to bring their experiences and perspectives to the table, as an asset to the course is really critical. And I think one other concrete example I might elevate would be offering alternatives for students who have technology impediments, and clearly delineating for all students, how and where they can get assistance if they need some type of support around course technology.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of institutions are probably thinking about, giving laptops out to students or setting up Wi-Fi. I know in one of our sessions this morning, the community college there was talking about setting up Wi-Fi in a parking lot where students could come and access, campus systems. Do you think that is there a challenge there in terms of just, having schools having the budget to do something like that? Like, how is there a way to ensure equity while having budget constraints?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first step is seeing this, as a priority. It really is important to ensure that all students have the same opportunity to learn. And so I think that's the start. I think that the other thing I would elevate as a strategy is to learn from other institutions. I think that there are a lot of institutions that have become very creative about the ways that they are messaging to students, about the resources that they're tapping into for students. And so I think now is not the time to try to reinvent the wheel, at every single institution, but, we should really be leveraging opportunities to share best practices and learn what's working in other contexts and adopt those best practices in our own settings.
Mm-hmm. So for faculty who are grappling with these issues for perhaps the first time, is there one sort of place where is the best place for them to start, like an easy win in terms of improving equity in their course?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think some really easy things to do, of course, would just be, number one, to just set the tone, on the first day for inclusivity. And, you can do that by making sure that you provide opportunities for the students to introduce themselves, taking care to remember and write down the students' names, to know the students' names, be sure to, prioritize, the correct pronunciation of the students' names, give the students an opportunity to talk about themselves, learn about their classmates, learn about you as an instructor. I think also just clearly introducing the learning goals, what the students can expect. the first day is just really the best day to set that tone for inclusivity and also clearly articulating how the course is relevant to the students' lives. That's something that comes up a lot, we know, for students of color specifically and some low-income students from different backgrounds, is it's easy to not feel connected to the course material, and then that can, down the road, impact engagement and motivation. So that's something that can be addressed very early on in the course. Another thing I think that would be kind of an easy win, and this is going to be incredibly important, I think, throughout the fall semester, is not being afraid to acknowledge and respond to difficult topics as they come up in the classroom and through the semester. We have a lot going on in our country, and a lot of it can be triggering and sensitive to a lot of our students, and a lot of it sometimes connects directly to the course content. So I think it's important to just be aware of the experiences of other students and of our students and how they may be affected by things that are happening, again, both in the course and also, in our country, in our day-to-day lives, and not be afraid to acknowledge and respond and make space for students to make connections and, respond to those difficult things that are happening in their world.
Mm-hmm. So then after the easy wins, are there sort of important next steps to tackle that maybe are a little bit harder?
Of course, there are so many things to continue to do. One it would be to diversify course material, to really take a step back and consider, what are you teaching? And consider whether or not, the video and audio content and the readings are communicating and welcoming diversity. Whenever that's not possible, I think it's also important to acknowledge that and acknowledge, what counts as knowledge in your discipline and why, and have conversations around that. I think another thing that you could do would be to make sure that you're assessing, early and often. Providing a lot of feedback to our students has been cited as something that's, a very effective best practice in the online learning environment. So, as often as possible, provide students opportunities to receive feedback on how they're doing in the class, but also allow students the opportunity to assess, your inclusive practices. I think, that can sometimes be a huge wake-up call and a reality check. If you ask students how they feel in your course, and allow them the opportunity to give some candid and real feedback that could be helpful for you in, making your course more equitable. And then I think another thing that would be, something to work towards would be to find ways to allow students to demonstrate their learning in various ways, when possible. I think that, there are a lot of biases that are linked to how we assess students, how we have been conditioned to understand, what it means to learn something or to know something. And I think one way to challenge that is to allow students to demonstrate their learning in different ways, particularly in some cases in non-conventional forums. But, we know that some students are, more articulate in group discussions, while other students may have really, really deep insights, but be more comfortable in, a one-on-one setting, or be more comfortable writing, in an online discussion. So I think, that's just critical to understanding that our students are all very different, and may have different ways of expressing themselves.
Mm-hmm. Is there something about, moving to the online format in some ways might be democratizing in terms of giving, students don't have to be put on the spot in a face-to-face class.
Yeah, and that could be very advantageous for some students. But again, I think we can't take for granted that that is the best environment for all students, because there are some students, for example, a student who English may not be their first language, may feel more comfortable communicating face-to-face than they do communicating in writing. And, so I think that's why it's just so critical to be sensitive and not make assumptions about, our students, particularly about how much they've learned when we're only assessing them in one way.
Mm-hmm. So in the spirit of continuous improvement, what are some ways that faculty can assess what's working or not working in their online teaching, and apply that going forward?
Well, I think that there are a number of resources that faculty could leverage. Professional development resources. I would certainly recommend the Every Learner Everywhere has a teaching and learning research page site known as Solve, where we have a lot of resources to help support faculty as they're, moving to remote teaching or thinking about introducing digital tools within their classroom setting. So I think, now is the time for sure to engage in as much professional development as possible and take advantage of the resources that are out there, because there are a lot of really rich resources. And if, you're looking for a place to start, for sure the Every Learner Everywhere website is certainly a great place.
Mm-hmm. Actually, let me move to the slide of resources. Could you talk about what some of these resources are that you put together? Of
course. So the Suddenly Online survey is the survey that I spoke about before, that was done by, sorry, it looks like we don't have both of them here. So the Suddenly Online is the one done by Digital Promise. That is a student survey, undergraduate student survey, and it looks at the experiences of undergraduate students in the transition online due to COVID-19. It's really, really fascinating work, and I definitely encourage that you look at that. The Time for Class COVID-19 edition contains information related to a faculty survey that was done by Titan Partners, and kind of outlines some of the experiences of faculty in the same transition. And then, of course, the faculty playbook is the resource that was done in partnership with OLC and APLU, and also funded by the Gates Foundation, that just really outlines so many different aspects of high-quality online instruction, how to transition your course. There's a huge focus on equity. And one of, my favorite things about the playbook is, it's very modular, so you can really just pick it up and dive in wherever you need to dive in. It's not something that you necessarily have to read cover to cover, although you can, and you would get, fantastic information from it. But you could also, kind of pick the section that you need the most support around and get some really great information out of it as well.
Mm-hmm. And for folks who are listening, I believe if you download the slide deck, which is in the Resource Center below the question field, you'll be able to access those other links. So one more question, going back to I think we talked about how important community is for students, and I was wondering if you have any advice for encouraging those student connections, remotely. I mean, it seems like it's quite a challenge, moving online to keep that sense of community going? Any ideas?
Yeah, I think you're right. It really is become a challenge. But we've seen some really great models emerging for, ways to allow students to stay engaged. Certainly, online forums have been helpful. I think creating some smaller online support groups that, maybe meet regularly and allow students to develop and maintain relationships even throughout a semester, the course of a semester, can be very useful. We know, that's something that has been found to be useful even, in an in-person setting, is to, build cohorts of students kind of within a class or, within a learning environment, and allow those students to, go through the course together and build relationships between each other over the duration of the semester. But I think, like I said, I think we still need to find ways to create some more of that one-on-one mentorship, and maybe even some student-led mentorship circles that would allow students to get more support from other students who may have developed some of the skills that are lacking in students who may be struggling with the transition to online. I think the peer-to-peer connections and finding ways to foster those, I think, is going to be really important in the fall semester.
Do you think students are ever reluctant to admit that they're struggling with online learning or their coursework in general? Is it hard to reach out, to reach those?
Absolutely. I think they're struggling. And I think that a lot of students, again, particularly first-generation students and low-income students and students of color, really struggle with having the agency to feel like they can reach out to anyone, but especially faculty or instructors for help. In some cultures and contexts, that's actually, very taboo. You don't reach out for help to someone who you see as, kind of many levels above you, unless, you absolutely need it. And I think, that's something that seems very common, instructors see, well, why wouldn't you reach out to me? But I think we have to just, like I said, be sensitive to the fact that some of our students just come from different cultural backgrounds, and what may seem like the norm in some contexts is not always the norm for others. And so I think normalizing reaching out for help and creating multiple, streams of ways that students can communicate with either their instructors or even their peers to get the support that they need will be very, very important.
Mm-hmm. I think it sounds like, institutions might need to be a little more proactive than usual in terms of their offers of support to students. That's something that actually came up in one of this morning's sessions where, the importance of just taking the extra step of vocalizing your support to students and talking to them more than perhaps you normally would.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Okay, so I think we'll next move on to a few questions that have come in from the audience. And I'd like to quickly remind everyone there's still time. If you'd like to submit a question, just look for the question field to the left of the slide window, type in your question there, and hit submit. So first off, one of our attendees is wondering, are you seeing more universities using tech support chatbots to help handle the increase in tech support needs? And do you have any suggestions for ensuring equity in this type of technology?
Yeah, chatbots have always been a really effective and equitable way for students to get the help that they need. At the institution I worked to previous to this role, Georgia State University, they have, they're known for their chatbot technology and the ways that it's supported students. The nice thing about chatbots is it really allows you the opportunity to ask questions that you may not always want to go into someone's office and ask. And I know this is particularly important around maybe some more sensitive issues, like financial aid issues. One example that always, comes up when talking about chatbots is that, sometimes students may be filling out the FAFSA and they haven't, maybe they're not living with their mom or their dad, they're living with grandma, and they don't know whose name to put on the the FAFSA document because, is it mom or is it dad or is it grandma, but I haven't seen mom or dad. And, and I think some of our students have just really, really complex issues. And I think, chatbots allow you it's a lot easier for you to ask those questions when you don't have to go in face to face and explain yourself to anyone, and you can still get the answers that you need. And I think the same is true, in our courses. I think that our students are dealing with really complex issues, and to be able to get the answers that they need without having to explain themselves to someone is very, very helpful. So I'm definitely supportive of chatbots. I think that many universities have leveraged this technology. I think the other thing that is important is, especially now that students are not able to get to campus, and, sometimes we know that, calling campus is not an option always either. So, and actually getting someone on the phone. So chatbots, again, allow students to really get that just-in-time kind of on-demand support that they need, that can make a real difference for them. So in terms of ensuring equity, I think the one thing that has come up is, some students feel hesitant to having to give their cell phone numbers to the institution to have access to the chatbot. So I think that it would just be important to ensure that students would still be able to maintain the privacy that they need or feel comfortable with to have access to the chatbot. And you could do that by, employing maybe just a web-based chatbot in addition to, one that maybe you respond to via text message. Ensuring that students can access the chatbot in different ways, I think, is important.
This might be a dumb question, but is there an advantage to just kind of knowing that it's a bot that you're asking the question to, and maybe, if you're not comfortable talking to a real person about it? I'm just curious.
I think for some students, yes. In the digital age where people actually feel more comfortable engaging kind of in these non-personal ways, there's so many studies now that say people would rather text message than call, or they'd rather text message than see someone face to face. I think that, this generation of students is just very familiar with engaging digitally. And so any opportunity that we can, take advantage of that and meet students where they are, I think is very important. Now, I will also add, though, that, we always have to be sensitive to the fact that not all of our students, are quote unquote traditional students, in the sense that they're not all, 18 to, 24 year olds who like technology. And there are students who are, older students. There are students who are, older adult students. They're working, they have families. So I think, that it's important to also keep those students in mind, and just not make assumptions that all of our students, are thinking the same way.
Another question that just came in, any insight on which is best between a blended class or online only? I guess for institutions still kind of sorting out what their plans are. What do you think?
That's a really tricky question. as we all know, because I think, everyone is being impacted by this decision. I think that some of the factors that, you might want to take into consideration to ensure that you're making, the decision from an equity lens, is, one, really understanding the demographics that you're considering making the decision for, understanding what these students need, what they have. I think another way to really ensure that you are getting it right is to honestly ask the students what they think. That's something that I think we don't do enough of, just directly reaching out to the populations that this question would most greatly impact and asking their opinion. I think the same is true for faculty, reaching out to faculty and asking them what they think. Because, the reason this decision is so difficult, and again, I know that everyone on this call listening is, facing, the same question or thinking about the same question from their own different perspectives. And there's no real easy answer here, because there are advantages and disadvantages and risks and challenges no matter what you do. But I do think that what's critical is ensuring that while we're making these decisions, that we are bringing all voices to the table intentionally, and making sure that, we aren't leaving out the voices of important groups of people when making the decision.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, this is a time where, for better or worse, institutions and faculty are being forced to take a close look at how they're delivering their courses. Is there an advantage to that? Like, is that going to, have a positive impact on things like equity going forward?
I really hope so. I'm very hopeful. One thing that we know, because we're dealing with COVID-19, we're also dealing, with a real movement around, anti-racism. And, one thing that is for sure is that disparities in student outcomes that are based on race, are a reality in higher education. We know that, Black students and Hispanic students and Indigenous students graduate at far lower rates than white students. And there are just real inequities that just built into our higher education system and have been for a very, very long time. And I do think that as we think about kind of the digital future of education, we have an opportunity to do something different. And I think that starts with understanding the discriminatory practices that have been embedded in our teaching and learning almost since the beginning of higher education, and redesigning our courses with students of color, low-income students, and first-generation students, at the center. And that's something that has never, ever been done before, and could just be tremendously transformative for our education system. And so I'm certainly excited and hopeful that COVID-19 will really accelerate some of the good work that's being done. But it's up to all of us to do our part.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there are a lot of things. Like, for example, making sure there's captioning on videos, an accessibility accommodation that it actually has a positive impact on everyone, because suddenly the content of the video is searchable, or, things that can really benefit all students. So I'm going to make one last call for questions from the audience. In the meantime, I'll ask one of my own. What do you think is in store, perhaps a primarily online fall, but for 2021, is this going to be an ongoing struggle for colleges and universities? What does the future look like to you?
Yeah, I think this will be an ongoing struggle, and not just because of COVID, but I think that, one thing that we've also seen is that this crisis has impacted Black and Brown students or Black and Brown people more than any other group. And so there are huge, economic ramifications to what's happening right now, especially with like our unemployment rate, and there are just a lot of really bad things that are happening and really harming some of the communities that were already very vulnerable. And I think that's going to certainly roll over and impact our education systems. We're also seeing, of course, a lot of financial instability for many of our institutions even right now, and there's no signs on the horizon that any of that will change anytime soon. So I think that from an institutional perspective, and also just from a student perspective, there's a lot of uncertainty on the horizon for sure, and there's a lot of potential for things to be very difficult, both for our institutions and for our students. And so, that does concern me. But again, I also think that, we still have the opportunity to really just rethink education and rethink how we're serving our students. And so, that inspires me. So, a lot of hard challenges ahead, but I think also some really exciting work that can be done.
Yes. So one final question just popped in. How can we promote teaching to be a profession for more students of color?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. That's a really good question. I think that it's important whenever you're thinking about professions. A lot of students of color, a lot of people of color find themselves being motivated by impact. And I think, two things. I think impact, and then also like salary and pay. And I think, so I'll talk about both, but I'll start with the salary. I think that teachers are underpaid. On every level, faculty are underpaid, instructors are underpaid, teachers are underpaid. It's such important work. And unfortunately, it's a profession that has gone unappreciated. And I think that has impacted, sometimes the way people perceive that profession. And then I think the other thing that's important to note is that there is a lot of racism that's very much embedded in our education systems. And I think it's, we can't ignore that and not address that and expect that people of color, students of color, are going to be interested in engaging in a system where they may have felt discriminated against or that wasn't supportive of them. So, I think we've got to do a better job of funding education and seeing it as valuable and important work and messaging it as such, and also eliminating, the racism and discrimination that many of our students experience throughout their education, their educational experiences.
Mm-hmm. And maybe also, having more mentoring opportunities like I think you mentioned earlier. Yeah.
Yep, I think mentoring is helpful as well.
Okay, well, I think that's all the time we have for today. I would like to thank Dr. Williams for a very informative chat, and thank you to our event sponsor, Citrix, for helping make today's conference possible. If you'd like to download a copy of today's presentation, just look for the Resource Center below the question field. And I'd like to remind you again that in the next day or two, we will be emailing you a link to the archived version of the session so you can view it again